All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. This is Overcoming Anxiety and Momentum Paralysis with Pastor John Stonge. I am Pastor Sean Grubb, presenter and coach with Servant Keeper Software. And this is part of the Church Leadership Training Series sponsored by Servant Keeper. And we are very excited to have all of you joining us today. We're confident that this will be a great benefit to you and your ministry. Now, Servant Keeper has been around since 1994. Servant Keeper has impacted over 35,000 churches. Over 8,000 churches in the last 2 years alone have turned to Servant Keeper. And these are churches of all denominations, all sizes, from churches that are tracking 25 people all the way up to churches that are tracking literally thousands of people. Servant Keeper manages small groups, Sunday school, attendance, volunteers, pastoral care, contributions, pledging, and much more. Servant Keeper offers an online directory and online profiles for your church members, and mobile apps for staffs to do everything from taking attendance all the way through to scheduling visits and more. Servant Keeper has online dashboards to show important analytical information to leadership, and Servant Keeper can help you with managing your ministry from beginning to end. So just want to give you some information here. If you want to learn more about Servant Keeper, then here's some information. I'm actually going to be posting some of these things in the GoToWebinar panel a little bit later on, so you'll be able to get connected that way. But just for your information right now, you're able to take a test drive of the free Servant Keeper demo at servantpc.com/demo. You can explore and register for upcoming webinars at servantpc.com/webinars. Of course, you can contact sales with the information there on your screen anytime you have any questions whatsoever about what Servant Keeper offers. And by the way, if you mention that discount code, you can see it there on your screen. You might want to jot that down. That's WB0720. Again, WB0720. Just jot that down, and that's going to give you a $100 discount on a brand new purchase of Servant Keeper if you use that within the next 30 days. So that's kind of just as a thank you for joining us today. So, again, we know that your time is precious, believe me, so we're so thankful that you could be here. All right. Now, before I turn it over to Pastor John, let me just direct your attention to the GoToWebinar panel, and there's an example of it there on your screen. Now, notice in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel, first of all, that there are some PDFs there for you to download. The first one is a worksheet for following along today. That's the anxiety and momentum worksheet. So you're going to want to download that quickly and maybe even print it up before John gets started here, and you can follow along with that. Secondly, notice the SK by Ministry Role PDF, and that's going to allow you to take some information along with you about Servant Keeper. You can share that with your team just to consider that as well. Okay, so go ahead and download both of those anytime. Then notice the question section in your GoToWebinar panel. And here's where you can enter questions during the webinar, and at the end, we will address a few of those as we have time. So please don't hesitate. We would like this to be interactive. So as we're going through the webinar, if comments or questions come to mind during John's presentation, then please go ahead and type those in the question section and hit send. Now, to practice using that a bit so I can make sure everything's working out okay on your end there, go ahead for now and type in there the state where you live and hit send, please. So go ahead in your question section in the GoToWebinar panel, just type in there your state and hit send, please, just so we can, again, make sure things are going well there. I'm going to give you some time to do that. Good. We've got some responses coming in there. Excellent. Go ahead and keep bringing those responses if you don't mind. All right. Okay, great, great. So thanks so much for joining us. Again, if you're just joining us live, then we're practicing using the question section of the GoToWebinar panel. Just type in there for now your state and hit send, just so we can make sure you're able to join us here. Good. All right, some more responses are coming in there. If you can't see your GoToWebinar panel, you might have to expand it. It might be minimized. So in the middle, in the little menu, you might just need to click on that arrow button to expand it. So that should make it available there for you. By the way, during the webinar, I'll probably be, or maybe closer to the end of the webinar, I'll be entering some of those links that I mentioned earlier in that question section of the GoToWebinar panel. So watch for those. That'll give you some ways to get connected with some other options. And by the way, you will also be receiving a recording of this later today. So at the email that you used to register with, watch for an email with a recording link. That'll be available. And you can share that with others as well. So, all right. Okay. Just kind of so we can get a feel for who's joining us here in the audience, we have a couple of polls here as well. So the poll that I'm going to run now is, what tools are you using to manage your ministry? So you should see the polls right there on your screen and be able to respond right there on your screen. So what tools are you using to manage your ministry? So you can make those selections right there on your screen. Are you using church management software? And you can apply all the, you can select all that apply there. So are you using a church management software program? Are you using QuickBooks or some other accounting program? Are you using Excel or spreadsheets? Maybe you're using pen and paper, maybe you're using Post-it notes, or maybe you're using a combination of those. So go ahead and select all that apply to you there, please. All right, I'm gonna give you another few moments to respond to the poll that's on your screen there. Again, this will help us get a little indication of your involvement here. All right, good. Looks like everything's working so far. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that, and I'm going to share that with you here. So we've got about 50% of you using a church management software, about 60% of you using QuickBooks or some other accounting program. 60% of you are using Excel or spreadsheets, 40% pen and paper, and 20% are using Post-it notes. Now, in relation to Pastor John's content for the webinar today, I've got some other polls I want to run here. And so the first one is, in your role of church leadership, what do you worry about most? And go ahead and just select the main one. So in your role of church leadership, what do you worry about the most? Declining numbers, relevancy, navigating changing opinions, or job security? So go ahead and respond to the poll there. This again, this and the next two polls. So just have two more after this. These polls will relate to the content during the webinar today. So in your role of church leadership, what do you worry about most? Go ahead and respond there, please. All right, so we've got most of the responses in there, I think. Make your last few choices there quickly. I'm gonna go ahead and close it here soon. All right, and let me share that with you here. So we've got about 29% of you say declining numbers, 57%, the highest there, saying relevancy, and then 14% saying navigating changing opinions, okay? All right, now what about how long has it been since your church has been experiencing a season of ministry momentum, what you would consider momentum, how long has it been since your church has been experiencing a season of ministry momentum? Um, it's experiencing a season of momentum right now, more than 2 years, more than 5 years, more than 10 years, or more than 20 years. So go ahead and make your selections there, please. And if you're just joining us, we're responding to those polls on the screen. You can make your selections right there on the screen. And also, if you're just joining us, then there's 2 handouts for you to download. The one for this webinar is the worksheet, Anxiety and Momentum. So I would recommend that while you're waiting, go ahead and download those, print them up, use them to follow along during John's presentation. He's going to be speaking here in just a few moments, for a few more minutes here. All right. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and share that with you. So 21% say it's experiencing a season of momentum right now, 7% more than 2 years, 21% more than 5 years, 29% more than 10 years, and then 21% more than 20 years, okay? One last one before we have John join us here. Are the majority of your church ministries focused on children and youth, or serving your present members, or reaching new people, or an ideal blend of all the above? So go ahead and respond to that poll there right on your screen. I think a couple more just joined us there. So if you're joining us, then we're responding to the poll on the screen there. You can go ahead and respond to that poll right there on your screen. Don't miss the handouts in the handout section. You can download the worksheet for this webinar called Anxiety and Momentum. That worksheet's there. So you would want to download that right away, print it up maybe, and use that to follow along while Pastor John speaks here in a moment. The SK by Ministry roll is information about Servant Keeper you can take along with you to consider later. All right, so go ahead and finish up responding to that poll. This is our last poll before John will speak here. All right. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll there and share that with you. So about 8% of you say children and youth, about 38% say serving your present members, 0% say reaching out to new people, and then 54% say an ideal blend of all the above. And maybe for those of you who chose the last one, you're including the reaching new people as well. So good. All right. Thank you so much for responding to that poll. Appreciate that. All right. Well, I would like to welcome Pastor John Stange to the webinar today. John is the lead pastor of Coral Creek Community Church in PA and adjunct professor of Cairn University and director of the National Mission Board. Pastor John holds degrees in Bible, education, and counseling, and he is a certified speaker, trainer, and coach. You can learn more about Pastor John and his ministry to church leaders by visiting his website. And you'll see that listed a little bit later on as well, but you can go to www.desirejesus.com. It's apparent to me that Pastor John has given himself to serve and strengthen the church, and so certainly thrilled to have him join us today and to turn it over to him now. Pastor John, welcome.
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be with you and great to be with everyone here on the call today as well. So I'm going to bring my slides up here for us. And Sean, maybe you could just indicate for me. Everyone see that okay?
I can see it. Yep, you're good. Yep.
All right, very good. Yeah, so today we're talking about this idea of overcoming anxiety and momentum paralysis. And this is the type of thing that I don't really recall either of these subjects being addressed a whole lot when I was training for pastoral ministry. I imagine that they were discussed some, but certainly not to the degree that we, as pastors and other church leaders that are on the call here today, probably deal with these things. In fact, I think many of us would probably have been hesitant to even say that anxiety is something that has the ability to creep into our lives because of the fact that at times, we look at that as essentially a sinful thing in many respects. And so, when you're in church leadership, sometimes it could even be hard to admit that you're wrestling with anxiety or that you're wrestling with anything that might be causing you personally to feel paralyzed in any way. But sometimes churches go through seasons where momentum seems like it's stalled. They go through a season of momentum paralysis. And so we're going to be talking about these things as if they go hand in hand, because in many respects, they definitely do. Now, let me just kind of start general, and then we're going to get specific from there. And if you have the worksheet that Sean linked to in the just the sidebar there, that you'll see that I made it really easy for us today. The different things that are open spaces on the worksheet I have underlined in the slide. So I do hope that that'll be helpful. Sometimes I tend to go a little fast through these things and can inadvertently skip something. So I don't want to do that. But what I want to talk about for starters here is the fact that anxiety is a common issue among humanity. This is not something that's uncommon. It's something that's common to us all. And when you boil down our feelings of anxiety, frequently it could be fed by our desire to control things that we have no control over. So when I do some self analysis, when I'm going through seasons where I feel a little bit overly anxious, one of the things that I've noticed is a pattern is that I find myself trying to control things that I don't have the ability to control, things that I never had the ability to control. And as a result, I find myself going through that cycle where anxiety gets spiked. And then I try and control things I can't control. And then I find out it doesn't work. And then it feeds more anxiety. And when that cycle became clear to me, I thought it was really helpful to notice that what I was doing was I was trying to control things I had no control over. So in our roles of leadership, we lead people. And when you're leading people, you don't have control over what people do. People make decisions. People live their lives in particular ways that maybe you agree with or maybe you don't agree with. And those decisions that those that you're leading make are decisions that are going to have an impact on the nature of the ministry that you're leading. And as a result, there are times that if we're trying to overly control things, we may struggle with feelings of anxiety. So just kind of keep that in mind. If that's something that you're noticing as a pattern at any given point, try to ask yourself the question, what am I trying to control that I have no control over? Now, our feelings of anxiety are also nurtured by something that we do. And when we try to address issues in our own strength, issues that should be turned over to the Lord, when we're trying to address these things in our own strength, we end up nurturing anxiety. And so that's not helpful at all. Sometimes we become overly reliant on our own wisdom, and we become overly reliant on our own strength instead of realizing that the Lord is right there with us in the midst of everything we're dealing with. And he invites us to turn our anxieties over to him, to hand these things over to him, and to trust him to operate with his strength to handle these things. Now, as much as we probably wish this wasn't the case, churches and pastors deal with anxiety. And in many conversations that I've had with pastors, I've noticed a pattern. And so I listed some of these things for us on the slide that we have right before us. What do we tend to worry about? What do churches and pastors tend to worry about? Are there some common themes? Now, I think that there are some additional things that could be added to this list, but I'll share some of the things that people have brought up to me. And one of the things that pastors and church leaders tend to be concerned about and worrying about is whether or not they're having a gospel impact in their community, meaning, are they helping people connect to Jesus Christ and the truth of his gospel? Or are they just going through the motions of day-to-day life of church responsibilities and what that looks like? And so pastors frequently are asking the question, Are we having a gospel impact in this community? Are we connecting people to Jesus? Are we helping people to recognize the importance of the gospel of Jesus Christ? So that's one area that churches and pastors tend to worry about. Another thing that I see is a big area of concern for many people, although I noticed those on the call today didn't necessarily pick this as kind of a top issue for them. Uh, but another area of worry or concern tends to come down to declining attendance or declining offerings. I'd be curious in that question section there. So I can't see any of that yet. Sean can see it right now. I can't see it yet, but I'll be able to. He's going to moderate these things later. I'd be curious about what some of your experiences right now with everything that's been going on. What the nature of attendance looks like in your context, what the nature of financial support has been looking like. I've experienced a few surprises in the context that I live in and serve in. And if we get a chance later on, maybe I could address some of those surprises. But this is an area, even just under normal times, some pastors find themselves thinking quite a lot about attendance and offering. And I wonder if there's even anyone on our webinar today that has had a low Sunday, particularly in a summer month, that kind of discouraged their feeling over the course of an entire week. If you've ever experienced that, where attendance was low, and all of a sudden you find yourself asking, "Am I? What do I need to do, or what's going wrong?" And so this tends to be an area that pastors tend to have a lot of concern over, or maybe even anxiety. How about this? The potential for conflict in the congregation. Do you ever feel like you're mediating disputes a little too much, and there are some people that are just waiting to blow up, and others that are waiting to react to that blow up, and in some contexts that I'm sure some of the leaders on the call here today operate in, you may have inherited some conflict with people, and so there can be potential for conflict in the congregation. Maybe even you're concerned about conflict that might arise from a ministry idea that you want to suggest, and you're planning on suggesting it, but you know that some people might dig their heels in and not really support that idea, and so you're wondering, is there potential for conflict even in that area? How about this? Struggling to reach young families and children and youth. Many of the churches that I work with, this is a persistent concern that comes up when I'm leading just in-person training or online training. Many church leaders tell me that it's a real struggle for them to reach young families in their community, and to reach children, and to reach youth. And so they tend to feel a bit anxious about that. They tend to worry at times about that. One other area that I have seen come up quite a bit, and that's the idea of unfair or unjustified criticism. I'm sure there are plenty of people on our call today that could point to times in their ministry where they have been the recipient of unfair or unjustified criticism. And typically that comes from people that have some sort of agenda where they're trying to, maybe force their will on the church, or force you to do something that really you don't think is a good idea for the church, but because it fits with their agenda, they want to, in a sense, push you or bully you into trying to do something. And if you say no, then you're on the receiving end of unfair or unjustified criticism. Or there are some people that seem to have nothing better to do than to pick apart their pastor, and so they do that. And I've certainly experienced this in my own ministry, but I've also experienced this in my relationships with others, where they have gone through seasons where they've really experienced a prolonged season of unfair and unjustified criticism, and it's produced anxiety in their life. Anxiety about what ifs can be mitigated if we ask, are we doing what we're called to do? So many of the anxiety producing thoughts that come through our minds tend to deal with what if scenarios. And we tend to imagine scenarios that we think, okay, this is a possibility that this might happen. And well, what if this person reacts this way? Or what if this happens in the church? Or what if the church budget goes down to this level? Or, do I need to do this a little bit better to reach people in the community? What if I try this and it doesn't work, et cetera, et cetera? And anxiety about what ifs can be mitigated if we start asking, are we doing what we're called to do? Meaning, I find it very helpful to sit back from time to time and take a moment and lift my concerns up before the Lord. And if I'm feeling anxious, just asking Him, Lord, am I doing what you called me to do? Because my what ifs are all about scenarios that I cannot control. I can't control how people respond. I can't control the reaction of this person or that person. All I need to know, Lord, is am I doing what you called me to do? And if I'm doing what you call me to do, Lord, I'm okay with that. And I believe our anxiety about what ifs can be mitigated if we ask the Lord that question honestly, because when the answer is yes, the best thing to do is to trust the outcome to God. It's His church, it's His mission, and His mission is going to succeed. So when the Lord gives you that yes, as you come before Him, you ask that question, Lord, am I doing what you called me to do? When the answer is yes, the best thing to do, just simply trust the outcome to God. Again, it's His church, it's His mission. His mission's not going to be thwarted. His mission is not going to fail. If He called you, He's going to equip you. He's going to help you. And maybe worldly metrics aren't going to measure what's taking place in the particular context that you're serving in accurately. But the Lord sees and the Lord understands, and He will accomplish His mission through you as you yield yourself over to Him. So don't let what ifs be a paralyzing and anxiety driving force in your life. Ask the question, are we doing what we're called to do? Now, what is the church working together with its leadership called to do? What are some of the categories that Scripture gives us? And again, we could probably add some subsets to some of these things, but look at some of the main things that when you look at Scripture, Scripture tells us that the church working together with the local church leadership is called to do some very specific things. One of the things Scripture tells us that we're called to do is to worship genuinely. We're called to worship. We're called to live lives that worship. We're called to gather together for worship. We're called to worship. So that's part of our calling. Something else that the church is called to facilitate, ultimately through leadership in the church, is teaching and preaching. So in the book of Second Timothy, one of the pastoral epistles, we have that addressed very clearly and very succinctly there, where teaching and preaching is something that's emphasized. And so a local church is called to teach and preach the counsel of God's word, the truth of the gospel. And if we're specific about it, when we look at Matthew 28, Jesus Christ in that portion of Scripture teaches us that we're to make the gospel known. So we're to worship, we're to teach and preach. The local church working together with its leadership is called to make the gospel known. Also in Matthew 28, that same portion of Scripture, we're called to make disciples. So we're called to teach people what it actually looks like to follow Christ. We're also called to care for those with needs. In the book of James, chapter 1, it talks about that, caring for those with needs. And so we have the privilege to do that. When you look at Acts chapter 2, it teaches us that the church, working together with its leadership, is called to practice healthy fellowship, where we're spending our lives with one another, where we're sharing meals together, where we're interacting with each other on a day-to-day basis, and we're building one another's faith as we fellowship with one another and choose not to isolate ourselves from other believers. And by the way, I have to say, in the midst of the current climate that we're experiencing right now, where everybody's encouraged to isolate, there's a spiritual danger that comes with isolation. And for us as church leaders that are trying to model these things for our church family, I'd encourage you to put your creative thinking caps on in regard to how you facilitate fellowship right now. Because if your church isn't meeting face to face together, there's still probably some ways that you might be able to utilize to facilitate that, because that's one of the things that the church is called to do. And there's a spiritual danger when we ignore the privilege that we have to fellowship with one another. So we might have to be creative in how we facilitate that right now. I know one of the things that we've been doing at our church, for the most part on Sunday mornings, is meeting together under, in a pretty normal fashion like we did prior to everything. But not everybody's comfortable with that. And so we have our live stream options. But also one of the things that I've been doing on Wednesday nights is leading an outdoor Bible study just on the property right next door to our church. And I just encourage people to bring camping chairs, and that way they could, if they're not comfortable being close to other people, this gives them the opportunity in the open air to still talk with one another and space their chairs out a little bit, and we study the scriptures together. And I enjoy doing it. It's a pleasant time of year for the most part, as long as we don't get rained on or it's not ridiculously humid, to have fellowship and to study the scriptures together. But we've been doing that on our church lawn on Wednesday nights, particularly to accommodate those that are really trying to be careful about interacting inside buildings with others. And so we're just trying to facilitate that in that capacity. The church is also called to pray. When you look in that same portion of scripture from Acts chapter 2, we're told that the early church was devoted to prayer. And so that's one of the things the church is called to do. And in addition to that, and this goes kind of hand in hand with discipleship, and it also goes hand in hand with some of the things that were mentioned in 2 Timothy chapter 4, where it talks about teaching and preaching, but the church is called to train leaders. So these are some of the main things that the church, working together with its leadership, is called to do. And I put this list together for us to visibly see on this webinar today, because there are many things that you as a church leader or you as a pastor are probably called to do in your local context by just force or the suggestions of others, that really doesn't come back to the main mission of the church, and it doesn't come back to the main mission for which you responded to the Lord's call into ministry that you responded to. And sometimes that can lead to anxiety and burnout and momentum paralysis, because we're spending so much of our time doing things that really don't matter and really aren't part of our main calling. And I talk to plenty of guys that will say, yeah, sometimes it actually makes me resent serving as a pastor, because I'm doing so many things that I didn't even think I'd ever have to do or worry about, that aren't really part of my calling, but yet here I am doing it. And so when you look at what scripture tells us, this is some of the main things. Again, we could point out a few other things as well, but these are some of the main things that the church and the church leadership is called to do. So I want that in front of our face so that we could answer the questions, am I doing what I'm called to do, with a list that we can consult. Now, what are some of the practical ways a pastor or a local church can deal with the anxiety that they may be feeling? And notice that I say this not just individually, but collectively, because it's not just pastors who deal with anxiety in their leadership role. Local churches sometimes adopt a mindset that is filled with worry and filled with anxiety. And so there are some practical ways that I think, whether collectively as a group or whether individually as a pastor or church leader, that we can deal with the anxiety that we may be feeling. And one of the most helpful things we can do is to stop trying to do it all alone, to seek reinforcements, to seek help. I have to tell you, just in my own life, and I'd be curious, maybe some of you could comment on this in the question section or in the comment section there. When do you tend to deal with the most anxiety? I know for me, I mentioned earlier, it's when I'm trying to control things that I have no control over, and it's when I'm trying to do things alone that would go so much better if I had additional help. So stop trying to do it all alone. Seek reinforcements. I think another thing that we could do that will help us deal with anxiety is that we need to stop measuring our success by worldly standards. The world tells you and I that everything needs to look a particular way, and usually the metrics that they're using are worldly numbers. So how many heads are in the seats, and how many, how big is the budget, right? And how big is the building? Our church building is relatively small for the ministry that we're doing. We have to be creative in what we do. In our area, real estate's very expensive. And so I wish we had a larger building, but we don't. And so there are people from time to time that will point that out to me. I've actually had some other pastors point that out to me. They'll comment on the fact that our church property is not as big as they thought it should be. And I thought, well, based on what standard? What standard says that a church building needs to be this size or that size? Like, could we stop measuring what success looks like by worldly standards? Does it have to be, 3 stories tall? Does it have to have, how many acres does a church have to have before it could have an effective ministry? And I think, we measure so many things by a worldly standard. And I think, all right, that's not the metric that the Lord is using. And all we're doing is we're producing anxiety in each other's lives because we're saying, all right, the world says that your building should be this big and your parking should be this. Oh, your church doesn't even have parking. Oh, well, I don't even know how you could have a church if you don't have, just a parking garage or something like that. Um, how about this? Um, in addition to seeking reinforcements, in addition to stop limiting your or measuring your success by worldly standards, and this one here, it's key. We need to commit ourselves to prayer and trust that the Lord still answers. Commit yourself to prayer, trust that the Lord still answers. This is ultimately his turf. He answers prayer. He wants the church to succeed, but he doesn't. He's not so concerned about it succeeding by worldly standards, but he does want to see change lives. He wants to see people come to faith in him and walk with him as his disciples. So pray to that end that the Lord would just strengthen and equip you and your church to accomplish that mission. Here's a couple other things that I think are practical as far as how we can deal with the anxiety we may be feeling. And a practical thing that we can do is identify an area of need in the church. So, one area of need in the church at a time, and then focus and pray and work and act on it until it becomes a strength. So, in the midst of all the pandemic news that was going on and all the changes we were experiencing in our local area, one of the major needs in our community was for food. Now, in our area, every time I've put up something in the past where we've given things away for free, people did not seem to respond to it. So I thought, all right, well, will this have kind of a dud of a response or not this time? But I kept hearing about people having needs for groceries and the inability to get it because they were losing their jobs and all sorts of things. And so what I did was I emptied our church of all that, since we weren't going to be meeting in there for a while. I thought, all right, well, we don't need all the stuff we have in supply here. We're not going to be using these food items and these snacks for children's ministries because everything's on pause right now or moving to an online format. And so I took all the food we had in the church and all the paper products we had in the church, and I set up sharing tables on the front porch of the church, and then announced to the community, "Come and take whatever you need." And I also announced to the community, if and our church family, if anyone has anything they want to share on these tables, just bring it and share it. And most days we would check on it just to make sure that everything was looking fine and that we were looking at the dates on the food, because now and then we'd find expired food that people would put on there. But for the most part, it went perfectly fine. And for some people, for 2 months, we became their main source of groceries. And so all we tried to do in that moment was not try and figure out 100 different things to do, but we looked at one area of need in the church or in the community. In this case, it was both. And we thought, all right, we can use the resources we have in the church right now to bless the community. Gave away toilet paper, paper towels, all sorts of paper products, and gave away a whole bunch of food. And then other people jumped on board, and some people started giving away baby supplies and all sorts of things. And so we were able to help a lot of families in the community for several months by meeting that need. And that, I think, is a practical way that we can deal with anxiety, because it starts to enable us to say, all right, what are we called to do? And just like it tells us in the book of James, we're at times we're called to meet needs like that. We're to help people with compassionate care. Something else that I think can be helpful for us is that we stay teachable and make use of the many available resources that we've been blessed with. So stay teachable, make use of resources. My suspicion is that since you're on this webinar today, you're probably the type of person who does stay teachable because you're trying to glean new information and utilize it for your own benefit and for the benefit of your local church. So continue to stay teachable. Now, if you've been dealing with ministry discouragement, and I would be shocked, by the way, to find out that if there's anybody on our webinar today that's never experienced ministry discouragement. I've definitely experienced it many times, and I'm certain that I don't even know that I'd believe a pastor that has been serving at least a few years that hasn't gone through a stretch of discouragement. But if you've been dealing with ministry discouragement, it's likely that it's been a while since you've felt like your church was experiencing some sort of genuine ministry momentum. So if you feel like the church is just kind of hanging in there, or maybe slowly losing momentum or something like that, odds are you've probably felt some discouragement about that. And maybe you've even felt like things have been moving backward moving in the wrong direction. So, how can this be corrected? If this is the type of thing that you're wrestling with, if this is the type of thing that you're dealing with right now, what does it look like to correct it? How can it be corrected? How can the church start to experience a new level of momentum, even just the beginning stages of momentum? Well, this comes back to something we were just talking about a second ago. I don't think it's overly complicated. And I think sometimes we think that we have to have some vast, amazing program to make a gospel impact in our community, but sometimes it's a little bit more simple than that. In your community, there's a need that your church can help meet. You might be uniquely poised to meet a particular need. Now, in some communities, the needs are obvious. In other communities, the needs might not be quite as obvious, but those needs are there. I know in our community here, whenever we would offer free stuff in the past, now in the pandemic, it was different, but in the past, when we would try and offer free clothing or free food, people didn't seem to want it because maybe they felt like they had too much affluence to take something free, whether they needed it or not. They didn't want to be seen as needing it. And so I thought, all right, what do you do when a community does not make their needs completely obvious to you? Well, one of the things that we discovered was anything that we did in the community that was for the benefit of children and youth, families were so grateful for because they were stressed out. So that was a need that we noticed in the community that we have been trying to be very intentional to meet, even in small ways. You know, we keep a stash of water bottles and popsicles and things like that at the church just so we could give those things away when people use the playground right next to our house, our church building, I should say. It's right next to the church building. The church owns it, and we just give away popsicles and we give away water bottles, particularly here in the summer. And so it's a small need, but we realized that that was a need that we could connect with the community about by meeting and serving young people. And so I would suggest that if you want to end your momentum paralysis, if right now you're going through a season where you feel like that we're just not moving anywhere, we feel anxious about it, we're not moving, in fact, we might be retreating, I would suggest that it's probably best to begin with meeting a need. You don't have to meet 100 needs. Just pick a need in your community that can turn into a bridge for the gospel to be shared. Look at what you're able to do. Again, it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It can be something small. You know, I did not consider it complicated for us to set up that sharing table that I mentioned. Um, I didn't consider that complicated. That was something that was rather easy to do. And it was one thing that really ministered to our community. So, real quick, let me pause right now, just real quick. And in the question bar, why don't you just put something there that stands out to you as a possible need in the community that you currently live in that your church might be able to meet? So let me just pause for a second while hopefully some of you type it. And the truth is, I can't even see whether you're typing it or not. All I can see is my slides. So do me the favor and put something in there that's a need that you can identify in your community that might even be something small that your church might be uniquely poised to meet. So take a moment to do that real quick. What need, or you could even put in there a need that you started to meet that you find extremely helpful as you're trying to make a bridge to the gospel. And while you're doing that, I'll make mention of the fact that just last week, right before our Wednesday night Bible study that we have outside, there were about 20 teenagers hanging out in our church parking lot. And I said to them, "Hey guys, what's going on?" They were at a distance from me, and they're like, "Hey, how you doing?" They seem pretty social. And I said, "You guys need anything?" And it was pretty hot that evening. It was almost like 100 degrees. And again, the kids were just parched. And I said, "You guys want something to drink, something to snack on? What do you guys need?" And they're like, "Yes, please." And so a whole bunch of them, we just bless them with snacks. We bless them with water bottles, things like that. I put out to the church a request this week, and I said, "All right, we depleted the things that we had on hand." So we had a big group outside the church the other day, and we were able to bless them and help them. And and so I asked the church, hey, could you help replenish our supplies? So I just throw that out there to say that sometimes those needs will show up, and they don't really have to be big things. They could sometimes be rather small things. But if you want to end the momentum paralysis, I think it's helpful to pick one need, something in the community that can turn into a bridge for the gospel to be shared, something that can help you build relationships or build trust with those that you're trying to serve in your community. Now, here's a few questions to ask if you're trying to meet a need in your community. First of all, ask the question, who lives here? I think that's important to answer that question. Who lives there? Because until you know who actually lives there, not who you think might live there, but who actually lives there, it's sometimes hard to discern what the need might be. So who lives there? And there's useful demographic websites that can help you with that. There's city data. There's also ePodunk, which is kind of a funny name, but it's a useful one. But ask the question, who lives there? Because if you know who lives there, you can actually figure out ways that you might be able to meet some needs. Or how about this? Do you have any existing relationships or connections with the people that live there? So if you already have some existing relationships or connections with them, that can be a useful thing as you try and bridge to the gospel. And how about this as a question? Are we eager to serve them, or are we still secretly hoping they'll serve us? I had the opportunity to speak at a church a couple years ago that I noticed one of the big issues that church was having was they wanted to connect with their community. At least that's what they said verbally. But what they were really hoping would happen was that the community would come and then serve them. And I thought, all right, you have that backwards. The idea isn't that the community would come and serve you. The idea is that you would serve the community for Christ's glory and not just secretly hope that they will come back in and serve you and fluff up your budget and fill your seats and do other things that seemed a little bit self-serving in the way that they were presenting it at that meeting. I thought, no, flip that script in your mind. Serve them. Don't just sit around waiting for them to discover you and serve you. So are we eager to serve them, or are we still secretly hoping they'll serve us? How about this? Again, what needs are present that we might be able to meet? When are we going to attempt to meet the need? I like to ask that question because a lot of us get bogged down in theoretical someday type answers. And when you ask somebody to put something on their calendar, it's more likely to get done if it gets on the calendar. So when are we going to attempt to meet the need? Eventually or on a specific day? How about this if you're dealing with some momentum paralysis? How will you celebrate victories? Prior to the pandemic, just 1 month before that, we had an indoor carnival, and it was very fun to celebrate the ways in which that ended up being a pretty effective outreach tool to families in our community that introduced them to our church, to our children's ministries, just relationally to us. So it was fun to celebrate with the volunteers that helped us pull that off. So when the Lord gives you a victory, how do you celebrate it? And then how about this? How will you regroup after setbacks? I remember one of the first outreach events that I hosted at our church when we were new here. It totally flopped, at least from my perspective, in that it didn't really reach people. I thought it would reach people, and it didn't seem to reach anyone. I had the wrong idea and the wrong approach, apparently. And so I remember right afterward thinking, all right, Lord, please help us regroup after this, because that seems like it'd be a real discouragement to our skeleton group of volunteers during those early days. And so the Lord helped us regroup and try something new. We didn't give up. We didn't beat ourselves up. We even celebrated the fact that, hey, we were willing to try this, admitted that it didn't work, and said, all right, well, let's figure out based on what we learned that what might work. So that was the approach we took, and future things tended to work a little bit better. But here's another question to ask so that you don't end up stifling your ability to do what the Lord's called you to do. What message will we be preaching to our hearts while we're in the midst of this process? And the reason I'm asking that is one of the things that we end up paralyzing ourselves with is our own self-criticism. And we beat ourselves up and accuse ourselves in such ways that we'll say, oh, you could never reach this community. Oh, everything you do is going to fail. Oh, you're going to try this and it'll flop, and then you're going to look foolish in front of your church family or something like this. And so it's important to be addressing the question that you're going to be preaching to your heart while we're in the midst of this process. That's something that you want to consider. Now, one of the major reasons that established churches experience momentum paralysis is because they've spent too many years primarily focused on themselves and not enough time focused on serving others. That's something that I've seen quite regularly, where people are focused on serving themselves, but they're not serving others. And as a result, they deal with momentum paralysis, but really all they've been doing is just continually serving themselves. They're not focused on new people. They're not focused on outreach. It's really an afterthought. They're just waiting for other people to discover them instead of actually going out and introducing themselves and introducing the church to those people. So, a couple follow-up questions to that. If you've spent too many years primarily focused on yourself and not enough time as a church focused on serving others, one of the big ways you could answer this question if you're focused too inwardly is this: how much does your church budget for outreach and evangelism? I asked one church how much they budget for outreach and evangelism, and I was told their yearly budget for outreach and evangelism was $200. And I said, "All right, that's it." And they said, "Yeah." And then the pastor said, "However, even if I spend that $200, I will get in trouble for spending it." And yet the church gets mad that it's not growing. He's like, "So we budget $200 for outreach and evangelism. If I dare spend that 200, I get criticized or chided." And he said, so it felt in his context like a no win because the church was primarily focused on itself and not focused on serving others. Follow up to that: how prepared are you to welcome visitors on Sunday morning? So when a visitor shows up, will they be greeted? Will they be welcomed? Will you have conversation with them, or someone on your team have a conversation with them? Will someone be prepared to show them where things are? Here's where the nursery is. Here's where you can hang your coat. Here's where we have a bulletin that you can grab. If you'd like a cup of coffee, it's over in this area. Restrooms, oh, they're over in this area. How prepared are you to welcome visitors on Sunday morning? Think about how you welcome visitors when they come and visit your home. You do nice things for them, like you take their coat for them, you greet them at the door, you're glad that they're there, you make a point to welcome them, you might even feed them. There's all sorts of things that you do when you welcome a visitor into your home. Well, how prepared are you to welcome visitors on a Sunday morning? How about this: how well can you tolerate your worship service being impacted by the noise of children or the actions of those who may not be familiar with the decorum? So, all of our churches have a decorum. All of our churches have a particular way we do things. And if you go there a few times, you start to get used to that decorum. You learn the routine, you learn the practices, you learn the order of worship. But a new person isn't going to be familiar with that. And what are you going to do if they bring their children with them? And maybe they're not right away using the children's options that you as a church have. So, how well can you tolerate your worship service being impacted by some of those disruptive things? Some churches have a culture where they would look cross eyed at somebody who might not be familiar with what's going on, or if their child makes a noise. I had a funny question this past Sunday, right after the worship service ended. Somebody asked me, was somebody snoring during the worship service today? Was someone snoring while you were preaching? And I said, I don't know. I didn't hear it if they were. And they said, I thought I heard someone snoring. And it turns out another person said, no, that it wasn't snoring. It was a child's toy that somebody had on a baby carrier. And the child kept pulling the thing down. And as it would spring back and retract slowly, it actually sounded like a person snoring. And I thought, I didn't even notice that. I couldn't hear it where I was, and maybe I was too in the groove of preaching to even pick up on it. But I was grateful that our church family didn't give that other family a hard time because of this baby rattle, because I was happy that that family was there, and just hoping that the church could put up with maybe a little bit of a disruptive noise that came from a toy. It wasn't a big deal to me, and I think sometimes if it's not a big deal to us, if you're the most visible leader in your church, if you don't make that stuff a big deal and you treat it like, no big deal, I'm just happy that people are here, I think that starts to carry out in the church as a whole. How about this? What would you be willing to sacrifice to reach one person or new family with the gospel? I think that's a useful question to ask when we're thinking about how do we end momentum paralysis. If it's been 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years since the church has experienced any sort of momentum, It's probably going to need to be some sort of sacrifice that you make of some preference somewhere to reach that one person or to reach that new family with the gospel. Something has to change. The way everything's been going probably needs to be tweaked a little bit if you've stopped reaching new people. And so that's something worth considering. There might be something you have to alter or sacrifice or just remove altogether and add something new to what you're doing. So what would you be willing to sacrifice to reach one person or new family with the gospel? So a couple ending things here, but before we get to questions and get to commentary, what will you do next? So, I just shared a variety of information about anxiety and momentum paralysis and some of the ways that that can be individually dealt with, so how it will be dealt with in your own heart, but how these things can be dealt with in the context of the local church. So, what will you do next? Will you assess whether your church understands what it's called to do? A little while ago, we talked about this idea of the calling of the church. What is the church called to do? So, will you assess whether your church understands what it's called to do, or does it have a misunderstanding of that? And how about this? Will you identify a need in your community and aggressively attempt to meet it? I think that's an important next step type question. How about this? Will you give up your desire to be served so that you could serve others? Or how about this? Will you establish an outreach budget if you don't have one? And maybe we could even say, if you do have one, will you take a look at maybe bumping it up? And if you do have one and you haven't been using it, will you start thinking about the importance of using it and focusing it on one particular area? And most importantly, will you cover this all in prayer and trust the Lord for the results? Because apart from his intervention, we're not going to find ourselves in a good spot. We need him to intervene. We need him to guide. We need him to direct. We need him to bless. So will you cover this all in prayer and trust the Lord for results? Now, before we get to discussion, I want to point out one last thing here. I shared this with the group a few months ago, but I'll share it again today because it fits with what we're talking about here. I have a free book available on my website, and it's called Healthy. And the content of that book came out of a sermon series that I preached to my church a little over a year ago. And it's all about this idea of looking at biblical wisdom for developing spiritual, physical, emotional, relational, and financial health. And when we're talking about momentum in a local church, a lot of times what we're talking about is what a church looks like when it reaches a healthy spot again, when it gets to a position of health again. So if you would like a free copy of that, there's really nothing you need to do. Just go to my website and you can download it free. But if you, I also have my email address there on the screen, because if anyone wants a copy of these slides, just send me an email, either today or tomorrow, whenever either if you're here live watching the webinar, just send me an email to john@desirejesus.com, and I can send you a copy of these slides so that maybe you could use them in conjunction with the worksheet that you have. If any of this content would be useful to present in your local church, you have my full permission to present it to your local church and use it in your local context, however the Lord leads you to use it. If any of this is useful for you, my concern is not to over copyright stuff. I just like to share it, and I hope it'd be a blessing in your context if you'd like it. So those are some freebies we have for you, and I'll turn it over to Sean. I don't know if we have any questions or maybe some follow-up that we can do on any of the topics that we talked about so far.
Yeah, so I think you answered a lot of questions probably as we went through it, but there are a couple of questions here, and but there was also some responses that I thought maybe I'd respond,
Yeah,
that
please do, because I
to your
can't see
questions. So
those. So
yeah,
yeah,
so I mean, some had responded with food and activities for youth, of course, so kind of along the lines of
along
some
meeting
of the things.
needs, right? Needs in the
Yes, yes,
community.
yep,
Yep.
yep. Meeting needs in the community. Yep, yep. One that I thought was particularly interesting was parking on street sweep day. So
Oh
I
man.
don't know if you know, I know in some communities I've lived in, you have to get your car off of
Yes,
the,
you do.
the street. Well, we have a church parking lot that's not probably not used much during that time. So I thought that was a pretty good idea.
That's very creative. Nice job.
Yeah, yeah. So now, in relation to that, I mean, so one of the other responses to that made me think of a question that you might want to address. One person mentioned hand delivering bulletins to people without the internet, um, and I think I get the heart behind that is to maybe for people that are in the church that um, maybe especially right now can't get the information easily. Um, but one of the questions that kind of brought me to mind for me that I would be interested in your response to is, what about, appearing like we're, and you even said something about this, but we don't want to appear too self-serving in our giving.
Yeah,
We want to kind of have quote unquote no strings attached, if you will,
right.
appearance. I would guess. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, as much as we'd like to say everything we do is from a completely pure motive, I know that we're complicated. We deal with our own sin and all of
Sure.
that. So I get that. I know that in the back of our mind frequently, we think about some of those other things too. But yeah, I mean, it's I think just being honest about our motives. We want to see people grow as disciples of Christ. We want to see the local church make an impact in the community. I don't think we have to make any sort of secret about that being an underlining motivation.
Okay.
And I would rather be criticized for doing too much than too little when it comes
Okay.
to
Good.
some of these things. And so,
Sure.
um, like you're talking about the person trying to make intentional connections by, hey, let me hand deliver the bulletin to some people that couldn't come out. Yeah, that's the type of thing that, in my opinion, this is just an opinion, that's going
Sure.
to be the type of thing that, if you're like my age and older, you would appreciate. And if you're my age or younger, you would probably lean more toward digital options, right? But
Right.
when I'm talking to my dad, something like that, my dad would look at it and be like, "Wow, that is
Okay.
the most thoughtful thing somebody's
Nice.
ever
Okay.
done," you know?
Yeah.
And
That
uh,
makes sense.
and so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of those questions that comes back to what we were talking about earlier. Who lives here? So if you're looking at your community, you're saying, all right, who lives here? Well, if the person living there would appreciate that because they don't have the opportunity to get it or do that. And some people are just so happy to have human interaction because their day-to-day life doesn't involve a lot of that. That might be a huge blessing to somebody.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. What about like with the needs, where and kind of talking about those in the church? I mean, how to, obviously, I'm thinking we should discuss those needs as a church, or at least maybe the church leadership. I mean, do you
Mhm.
have thoughts about how to inspire the people along that line?
Definitely. I have a very specific thought about it. And I
Okay.
would say, so to the church leaders on this call here, um, pick something that you personally feel passionate about to start with. And even before you try to drum up support for it, start doing it yourself. Model it. Just do it. So the sharing table idea that I mentioned earlier, that's something I felt strongly about doing. I didn't have a committee or anything like that. All I did was I talked to the person in our church who's responsible for ordering those supplies. And I said to her, I said, all right, here's an idea I have. There's People cannot get paper products in stores, but we have a whole bunch of them here in the church, and we're not even going to be able to use these things for a long time. And I'm sure we'll be able to get more through the many people that are part of the church family, even if they all just brought a roll of paper towel, once the pandemic ended. We could
Right.
restock ourselves a lot quicker than an individual might be able to. I said, even though it's going to create more work for you once this is all over, are you okay if I start giving a bunch of this stuff away? I already knew she'd say yes because she's a giving
Okay.
person. And,
Sure.
and but I wanted to include her in that discussion, but she was really the only person I felt like I needed to talk to about that. I didn't make it a big program right away. I just went and did it because I felt passionate about it and excited. And I brought a bunch of stuff from my house too. So, I can give away my own stuff to anyone I want. So
Sure.
I just brought a whole bunch of that. Then after I was already doing it, then I said, listen, this is what we're doing. There's a need. Do you want to join me in it? I didn't just say to the church, hey, you guys go do this thing because there's a need. I said, there's a need. I'm doing this already. Anyone want to get on board and join me? And a ton of people got on board. And I wasn't surprised because I wasn't talking about theory. And I wasn't pointing the finger and saying, you guys go do this. They were watching me do it and saying, all right, you're leading by example. We will join you in what you're already doing. You already set it up. You're already improving it. You're taking suggestions and ideas from people, and you're giving us a chance to participate. Went way better. So I'd encourage those
Nice.
that are on the call here, pick a need you like, pick a need you feel passionate about, pick a need that you would do even if no one joins you, and then invite people to join what they can see you doing. Because if they see
Nice.
you doing it and hear you talking about it, they're more likely to get excited about too. And you won't get
That's
sick of
good.
trying to lead people in that direction because you feel excited about it personally.
Nice. Good. So one last thing, and this is probably a pretty involved area, but I just thinking of, there might be some people thinking at some point, if no momentum, if you will, can be stirred, is there ever a point at which you would just kind of throw in the towel, so to speak? Or what would you say to encourage maybe more endurance, beyond that even? Um,
So what I would encourage any of us to do, because we all go through stretches like that where we feel ready to quit. I have had several where I've honestly felt ready to quit. Thankfully, not recently. um, but but if I'm honest with you, I went through a stretch 5 years ago where I really I felt pretty close to quitting, and so all I could tell you is what I did in that moment. And what I did in that moment was I prayed about it and I talked about it with my wife and asked her to pray about it. And so we just prayed and just said, Lord, uh, give us the indicator. I feel defeated right now. I feel beat up. I feel discouraged, and I'm at a spot where I'm saying, like, if you wanted me to do something different, I'd be more likely to say yes right now than some other time. So, Lord, indicate to me, what do you want me to do? Stay put or not? And and he made it clear to me in a variety of ways, even just in the peace that he gave to my heart about staying put, that I was to stay put. And I waited it out a little bit. I didn't make a rash decision and try and make that decision just in a day. I gave the Lord time to answer, through prayer, through circumstances, through whatever he would orchestrate, through just the still small voice of the Holy Spirit. Make it clear to me, Lord, what your will is. And what he ended up doing was he made it clear, like, no, absolutely stay. And
nice.
when he made it clear to me, by that point, I was like, I can't even believe I was questioning whether or not I should stay. But
Oh,
I was just at a low spot, and
sure.
I was really wrestling with it. And I felt really defeated, and had dealt with a whole bunch of the categories that we had talked about earlier in the webinar. It just wasn't
Yep.
I was at a low point, and we all hit those spots from time to time. I'm not eager for the next one if it comes, because I've gone through it a few times, and I hope that there's long spaces of time in between. But yeah, lifting it up before the Lord, and certainly lifting it up before your spouse, and even maybe a few people that you trust that would keep it close to the vest, and not really make it known that you've been wrestling with it. People you could trust, and give time for the Lord to answer that prayer, but only make those moves when he indicates it's time to do it. Don't get ahead of his plan, because worldly success and what success actually looks like from the Lord's perspective are very different. So maybe you're not seeing the numbers you want to see. Maybe you're not seeing the outcomes you wanted to see. But maybe the Lord's will wasn't for those things to be the case in your context anyway. Maybe his mission was totally different from what you're assuming. And so you got to trust him to accomplish whatever nuanced vision he has for the ministry that he's called you to.
Nice. Good testimony, good encouragement. Thank you, Pastor John. Appreciate that. So, all right. Well, I have one more poll that I'd like to, actually two more polls here I'd like for you to respond to, if you don't mind, because we do appreciate your opinions about these webinars and so forth. And so if you don't mind, go ahead and take another, moment or so here and respond to that poll. I'm going to launch it here. And how would you rate today's webinar? and just select the one that is the most appropriate. Number one, not very helpful for my role in the church. Two, somewhat helpful for my role in the church. Or three, very helpful for my role in the church. So go ahead and take a moment to respond to that poll. And while you're doing that, I am going to post a link to register for our next webinar with Pastor John. So that's going to be available in your question section of the GoToWebinar panel. So I just posted that there. And so I'm going to tell you more about that upcoming webinar here in a moment, but that's a link to go ahead and register for it. Go ahead and again, respond to the poll there on your screen. How would you rate today's webinar? And we would appreciate your honest response to that as we consider future webinars. All right. Go ahead and get your last responses in there because I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. All right. And then one final one, what best describes your next steps? So if you don't mind, go ahead and respond to that poll as well. And while you do, I'm going to post a link to take a test drive of Servant Keeper demo and also to learn more. So that's going to be available as well. Don't forget to take the handout from the handout section there available to you. Let's see here. All right, there you go. There's a link to learn more about Servant Keeper, take a test drive of the free demo. And I'm going to be posting information to connect to our sales team here in a moment as well. All right, good. Those responses are coming in there now. Almost going to close that. Just get your last responses in there, please. All right, thanks so much for responding to the poll there. All right. All right. All right, so our next webinar with Pastor John is going to be Secrets to Lasting in Leadership Over the Long Term. That's going to be on September 15th at 1 Eastern. And there's a link, again, available in the chat section or the question section of the GoToWebinar panel for you to register for that. Set that up and so forth. So again, Secrets to Lasting in Leadership Over the Long Term on September 15th at 1 Eastern. And then I'm going to go ahead and leave this last slide up there for you to see those links, also see the contact information, and also jot down that discount code. So if you jot that down and mention it to our sales team, and purchase Servant Keeper within the next 30 days, you can get a $100 discount there. So that's just kind of as a thank you for joining us today. Appreciate that. So, all right. Well, thank you, Pastor John, for sharing your wisdom and experience with us today.
Thanks for the invitation. Always enjoy it.
Certainly. And those attending today, want to thank you so much as well for joining us, and we'll be looking forward to you joining us for future webinars. And thanks again. All right, you guys have a blessed day.